Bundy was first arrested in August 1975 in Granger, now West Valley City, when he refused to stop for a routine check by a highway patrol officer. A search of his car turned up a ski mask, a pantyhose mask, a crowbar, garbage bags, a roll of rope, handcuffs, an ice pick, and other items commonly used in burglaries. Bundy explained that he needed the ski mask for skiing, found the handcuffs in a trash can, and found the rest of the items as household items. However, Detective Jerry Thompson recalled that a similar man and car were wanted for the DeRanch kidnapping, as well as the name Ted Bundy, which Klopfer had given. Police searched his apartment but found no hard evidence against Bundy. He later said that they did not find photographs of his victims, which he had hidden in a closet. Bundy was released on bail. The Salt Lake City police placed Bundy under 24-hour surveillance, while Thompson and two other detectives traveled to Seattle to interview Klopfer. She told them that in the year before Bundy left for Utah, she had found items in his possession that she couldn't explain: a set of crutches, a bag of plaster, a butcher knife that had never been used for cooking, surgical gloves, an Oriental-style knife in a wooden case, and a bag of women's clothing. She also recalled that Bundy was constantly in everyone's debt. She suspected that everything of substance he owned, Bundy had stolen. Once, when she began investigating the origin of a new television and stereo, Bundy warned her that if she told anyone, he would wring her neck. He also became very upset every time she cut her long hair. Sometimes she would wake up to Bundy peering under the covers with a flashlight. He kept an Allen wrench in the trunk of her car. She also owned the Volkswagen Beetle that Bundy often borrowed, supposedly for protection. Detectives learned that Bundy was not with Klopfer on the nights the girls disappeared. A short time later, Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney interviewed Klopfer and learned of Stephanie Brooks and her engagement to Bundy in 1973. In September, Bundy sold the Volkswagen to a Midvale man. It was confiscated by Utah police, and FBI technicians disassembled and examined the car. They found hairs matching Karen Campbell. Strands of hair from Melissa Smith and Carol DeRanch were also found, but they were deemed microscopically indistinguishable. FBI lab worker Robert Neal concluded that finding strands of hair in one car, randomly placed there, from three different victims who had never met in life would be a coincidence of staggering rarity. On October 2, 1975, DeRanch identified Bundy as Officer Roseland. Witnesses in Bountiful also identified him as the stranger hanging around the school where Deborah Kent disappeared during a theater production. There was insufficient evidence to charge him in the Deborah Kent case, but more than enough to charge him with the kidnapping and attempted assault of DeRanch. He was released on $15,000 bail, paid by his parents. He spent much of the time between his arraignment and trial at Klopfer's home in Seattle. Despite his release, he was closely watched. When we went out, Klopfer wrote, so many police cars would pull up behind us that it was like the start of the Indianapolis 500. In November, the three lead Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson of Utah, Robert Keppel of Washington, and Michael Fisher of Colorado, met and exchanged information with other investigators from 5 states in Aspen. As they left the meeting, later known as the Aspen Summit, they decided that they needed to gather hard evidence before charging Bundy with more murders, even though they were confident that he was the killer. On February 23, 1976, Ted Bundy went on trial for the kidnapping of Carol DeRanch. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, he exercised his right to a jury trial. On May 1, after 4 days of trial and 2 days of deliberation, the judge found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. Bundy was sentenced to 15 years in prison in Utah. In October, he was found hiding behind bushes in the prison yard. He was holding an escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card. For this, he spent several weeks in solitary confinement. A month later, Colorado authorities charged him with the murder of Karen Campbell. For this, he was transported to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was transported from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, to the Pitkin County Courthouse for a preliminary hearing. He chose to represent himself, so he was not handcuffed or shackled. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse library to do some research. Hiding behind a bookcase, he opened a window, jumped from the second floor, spraining his right ankle, and fled. He made his way out of town over Aspen Mountain. He rested for several days at a hunting cabin near the summit. He then headed south to the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the woods and wandered aimlessly for 2 days. On June 10, Bundy broke into a camper trailer at Maroon Lake, 10 miles outside of Aspen, stealing food. 3 days later, he stole a car from the Aspen Golf Club. With a cold, sleep-deprived, and suffering from persistent ankle pain, Bundy drove back to Aspen, where his car was spotted by 2 police officers. He was on the run for 6 days. Brought back to Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of his friends and legal advisors to stay there. The initially flimsy case against him for the kidnapping and murder of Karen Campbell was crumbling before his eyes. Several findings were made in Bundy's favor, and some direct evidence was ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant would have realized that he had a good chance of being acquitted in the Karen Campbell case. That might have dissuaded other prosecutors from his guilt, and then another year and a half of work on the Durange case, and he might have been a free man. Instead, Bundy hatched a new escape plan. He got hold of a hacksaw blade and, over the course of 6 months, raised $500 in cash from visitors, including Carol and Boone. He cut a small hole in the ceiling of his cell. Bundy, who had lost much weight, was able to squeeze through it. Over the next few weeks, he made several practice runs, exploring the perimeter. An informant told officers that he heard movement in Bundy's cell at night, but this was not verified. On December 23, 1977, it was decided to move the trial to another judicial district, Colorado Springs. On December 30, Bundy used books and documents to create the appearance of his body lying on a bunk bed and escaped. He broke into the apartment of the prison warden, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into his clothes, and left through the front door. Bundy stole a car and drove east from Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down. A passing motorcyclist gave Bundy a ride to Vail. From there, he boarded a bus to Denver, and from Denver, he flew to Chicago. Ted Bundy was not discovered missing until 17 hours later, at noon on the 31st. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. From Chicago, Bundy moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus to Tallahassee. There, under the name Chris Hagen, he rented a room near Florida State University. Bundy later said that he planned to find a job and quit killing. He knew he could remain free in Florida as long as he did not attract the attention of the police, but he had to turn down the only job he was offered at a construction site because the employer required his driver's license to identify him. So Bundy began shoplifting food from stores and stealing credit cards from wallets left in grocery carts. A week after arriving in Tallahassee, at approximately 2:45 a.m. on January 15, Bundy entered a Florida State University dormitory through an unlocked back door. Entering Margaret Bowman's room, he brutally beat her with a log, stripped her naked, and then strangled her with her pantyhose. He then entered Lisa Levy's room, beat her with the same log, then bit off one of her nipples, bit her buttock hard, raped her, including anally, with a bottle of hairspray, and strangled her with pantyhose. In the next room, he attacked Kathy Clanner, cracking her skull, breaking her jaw, and severely damaging her shoulder, and Karen Chandler, cracking her head, breaking her jaw, knocking out her teeth, and crushing her finger. As Tallahassee detectives later determined, all of this happened in just 15 minutes, within earshot of more than 30 people who, however, heard nothing. After leaving the dorm, Bundy ran several blocks and entered a house rented by 3 students. He climbed through a window into the room of University of Florida student Cheryl Thomas. He beat the student while she was sleeping, dislocating her shoulder, breaking her jaw, and breaking her skull. He undressed her and masturbated her. Semen was found on the sheets. She was only saved from death by the fact that her neighbors came home late and had not yet gone to bed. They heard a noise in Cheryl's room, but were afraid to go in and began calling her on the phone. This scared Bundy, who escaped through the window he had climbed into. Cheryl survived, but she suffered partial hearing loss and damage to her vestibular system, which put an end to her career as a dancer. On February 8, Bundy went to Jacksonville in a van stolen from the University of Florida. There, he approached a 14-year-old girl named Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of a police officer, in a Kmart parking lot, introducing himself as firefighter Richard Burton, but quickly left when her older brother showed up. That same day, he drove 60 miles west to Lake City. The next morning, a Lake City elementary school teacher released the 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was taking her home to retrieve her forgotten purse. She never returned to class. An intensive search revealed her partially desiccated, mummified, remained 7 weeks later in a pig barn 35 miles, 56 kilometers, outside of Lake City. Bundy was having financial problems and began to suspect that the police were closing in on him. So on February 12, he stole a car and drove back to Tallahassee. 3 days later, near the Alabama border, he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee, who suspected that his car might be a recently stolen Volkswagen Beetle. After checking, Lee attempted to arrest Bundy, but Bundy kicked him in the leg and fled. The officer nonetheless detained him. In the car, they found University of Florida student identification cards, 21 credit cards, and the television he had stolen. On the way to the police station, Bundy told David Lee, who had no idea that he had captured one of America's most dangerous criminals, "I wish you'd killed me." Bundy was charged with the murders and the attack at the University of Florida dorm. The trial was covered by more than 250 journalists from all 5 continents. It was also the first trial to be televised throughout the United States. Despite the fact that the court appointed 5 lawyers for him, Bundy again insisted on defending himself. The prosecution attempted to negotiate a plea agreement with Bundy. In exchange for confessing to the murders of Levy, Bowman, and Leach, they offered a 75-year sentence rather than the death penalty. The prosecution agreed to this because the prospects of losing the case were very high for them. For Bundy, this was not only a way to avoid the death penalty, but also a tactical move. He would agree to a deal, and after some time, evidence could be lost or damaged, witnesses could die, move, or withdraw their testimony. In this case, the case against him would be impossible to rebuild, and he could file a motion to set aside the deal and ensure his acquittal. However, at the last minute, Bundy backed out of this offer. The prosecution's key evidence was the testimony of Connie Hastings, who saw Bundy on the dormitory grounds, and Nita Neary, who saw Bundy leaving the dormitory with a log in his hands. Other evidence was a bite mark on Lisa Levy's buttock that matched Bundy's teeth. The jury deliberated less than 7 hours and found Bundy guilty of 2 counts of murder, 3 attempted murders, and 2 counts of burglary. The judge sentenced Bundy to death for the 2 dormitory murders. 6 months later, Bundy was brought to trial in Orlando for the kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Leach. Bundy was again found guilty and sentenced to death. The main evidence against him was the testimony of a woman who saw Bundy take the girl from the schoolyard to his van. Important physical evidence was also the fibers found on Leach's body, which matched the fibers from the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the final stages of the trial, while Carolyn Boone was testifying, Bundy unexpectedly proposed to her. Boone accepted, and Bundy announced that they were now married. Under Florida law, an oral declaration of marriage in the presence of a judge is considered a valid marriage. On February 10, 1980, Bundy was sentenced to death in the electric chair for the 3rd time. When the verdict was read, Bundy stood up and shouted, "Tell the jury they're wrong." Shortly after the Leach murder trial and the lengthy appeals process, Bundy gave a series of interviews to Michaud and Ainsworth, speaking largely in the third person to avoid confessing, where he first revealed details of his murders and his mindset. In April, he revealed more to Hagmeyer and Nelson, describing how he often returned to the sites where he had left his victims' bodies to lie next to them and have sex with them until they had completely rotted. In some cases, he would drive for hours and stay overnight. In Utah, he put makeup on the face of the already dead Melissa Smith and washed Laura Amay's hair. He also decapitated at least a dozen of his victims with a hacksaw, keeping their heads in his home as souvenirs and sex toys. When the girls' heads had completely decomposed, Bundy would dump them in the woods or burn them in the fireplace of his common-law wife, Klopfer, for he confessed to Keppel to 8 of the already known murders in Washington and Oregon, in which he was already the prime suspect, and to 3 more, but refused to name the victims, if he ever knew them, to leaving Donna Manson's body on Taylor Mountain and burning her head in Elizabeth Klopfer's fireplace. He described in detail how he lured Georgiana Hawkins to his car, knocked her out, handcuffed her, drove her to Issaquah, raped and strangled her. He stayed in the car with her body all night and returned to the corpse 3 more times. Bundy confessed to detectives in Idaho, Utah and Colorado to a large number of crimes that the police knew nothing about. He said that in Utah he was able to bring the bodies of his victims home to recreate scenes from the covers of detective magazines. His hidden strategy soon became clear. He kept the details incomplete, hoping to have his execution delayed yet again. He said there were other burial sites in Colorado, but refused to specify where. There were times when he did give details that were not confirmed. Colorado detective Matt Linville believed that this behavior was a result of a conflict between his desire to delay the execution and his desire for complete ownership. He wanted to be the only person who knew all the places where his victims were buried. Bundy never revealed the real picture of his crimes, limiting himself to half confessions, half hints. On the eve of his execution, Bundy talked to investigators about suicide. He didn't want to give the state a chance to admire his death, Hagmaier said. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. Eastern Time, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at the Florida State Penitentiary in Rayford. During the execution, a crowd of about 2,000 people celebrated in front of the prison, singing, dancing, setting off fireworks, and cheering as Bundy's body was taken away in a hearse.